Thank you, everyone who has tuned in. We're really excited to be here today for a webinar on building an inclusive emergency aid approach for dual-enrolled students. I'm Rebecca Kelleher. I'll be the moderator. I'm a staff writer at Diverse Issues in Higher Education, and I'm very excited to introduce our panelists for today. I'm joined by Dr. Keith Curry, who's the president and CEO of Compton College, and also David Helene, who's the CEO and founder of Edquity. And our third panelist, Traci Kirtly, who's the executive director of Believe in Students, unfortunately isn't going to be joining us today, but we'll have plenty of opportunities during this discussion to talk about Believe in Students' critical work in this project. So first of all, just to set the stage, we'll be talking today about a recent report that was looking at how Believe in Students, Edquity, and Compton College teamed up to get emergency aid out to dual-enrolled students at Compton College. This is the first known emergency aid program that was specifically for dual-enrolled students. It launched in November 2020, and then over the next year, it provided almost $60,000 in direct aid to students. And before we started to talk with our panelists, we wanted to first show a video of a student who is dual enrolled at Compton College and who benefited from that program. And just a quick note that the sound on the video is a bit low, so just be sure to dial up the volume on your devices, and we can play that.
Hi, everyone. This is Larry. I'm Edquity's Vice President of Partnerships here and running behind the scenes everything that we can. Apologize for the volume with the video. I think what's happening is the volume is just so low, Zoom is not picking it up. So what we'll do is we'll make sure that we send out a link to the video for everyone so you can access that and hear the testimonial from the student.
Great. Thanks so much, Larry. Well, I would definitely encourage you, once you get a chance to have the link in your inboxes, to take a look at the video, because it's great to hear a student talk in their own words about their experience. And yeah, the link just came through, which is great. Thanks so much. And so we wanted to first turn over to Dr. Curry. We would love to kind of hear a little bit more about the origins of this initiative, as well as kind of the specific dynamics at Compton College. I think our panelists and our audience would be really interested in learning more.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Rebecca, and also David, for allowing me to participate in today's webinar and to answer any questions that the audience might have. My name is Keith Curry, President and CEO of Compton College. I've been in this position since March of 2011. Compton College was the first community college in the history of California community colleges who accreditation was revoked in 2006. Became fully accredited in 2017. And then became a separate independent college in 2019. Actually, the accreditation and also separation become an independent college all happened on June 7th. So today is a big day in the history of Compton College. And so I remind myself of that as we think about this new innovative approach to dual enrollment and providing support for dual enrollment students. Compton College, as an accredited college in 2019, we implemented our guided pathways structure for our organization, where our students are grouped into similar areas for their guided pathways division. So, for example, we have our social sciences division, which has our social science programs, including sociology, history, ethnic studies, but we group them in similar majors. And why this is important, because this gets into the origins of the work that we do around guided pathways and dual enrollment. So being structured around guided pathways and want to see our students complete. Last year, when COVID initially started, we started looking at doing emergency aid for students based off of their major guided pathways number of units. But students who are in dual enrollment were not provided with that opportunity. And so we were having a conversation with Edquity and Believe in Our Students about a unique program for our dual enrollment students, providing them with emergency aid. And so through the help from the ECMC Foundation, we were provided with these funds to be able to allocate emergency aid. And what we did was we were able to allocate, based off our college being the 114th California Community College. As I mentioned, we gained accreditation on June 7th. We made the allotment of $114, which is also a marketing tool for our organization. And so our goal was just to be able to provide the support for our students. What we learned during COVID was that our dual enrollment students had issues with laptops. They had issues with Wi-Fi hotspots. They also had concerns regards to emergency aid. So our approach was, if our current students are having issues and we're providing additional support, what are we doing for our dual enrollment students? Our campus, like other campuses, have saw an increase in dual enrollment students over the years. So what type of support can we provide? And that's where we were able to create this unique partnership with Edquity and Believe in Our Students to provide emergency aid. There was a lot of work that was done on our staff part to make this happen, and that's one of the challenges that we can discuss as it relates to the today's webinar. But the origin started with just recognizing that our student population, based off of racial equity, was not receiving a benefit or support through emergency aid in order for them to be successful. And so we identified this as a problem for our students, and work with Edquity and Believe in Our Students. We were able to implement this robust program for our students.
Great. And that leads me to learn a little bit more from David about some of the tactics that you then employed with Believe in Students in order to get emergency aid out to these students.
Thank you, Rebecca. And first and foremost, let me apologize to the group, as one of the challenges from working from home is you get the background noise of a home working environment, which today is a very windy day here in New York City. But first and foremost, it's a pleasure to be here with everyone. It's always, a tremendous honor to be in a space with Dr. Curry, who, as we've heard, is a tremendous visionary for the work that he's done at Compton College, and here germinating on what has become the first of its kind type program for dual enrollment students in the country. As we began serving this population, again, it's critical to identify that this population of students tends to be quite different from other populations of students who are college going. So the average age of students that applied for emergency aid through this program was 16. That's a far cry from what we see at community colleges national, which is typically 30, right? So we're dealing with a student population almost half the age of those that we typically serve across the country and even at Compton College. And the types of challenges that students are facing has been a little bit different from those that we see nationally. So typically, housing and transportation, as well as food, which is a close third, tend to be the three largest issues that students are facing. In this context, we saw that while 51% of students were dealing with multiple issue areas at a time, the top issue areas were learning. 45% of students were dealing with learning issues, similar to what Dr. Curry outlined, right? Access to technology or other resources, transportation, food, and housing. Again, a slightly different set of needs that students are experiencing. I will use this as a shameless plug to remind folks that whereas one of the big wins of ARPA policy has been the expansion of free and reduced lunch for K-12 students, which has reduced child hunger by about 50% over the last year. Those credits are set to expire. So I do want to put that on folks' radar, that food insecurity for that set of students and for dual enroll students may be increasing over time as we see K-12 policy changing. But one of the things that was a big difference, right, is that these sets of students are not only and fundamentally interacting with Compton College, right? They're actually dealing with their school district and the promise of free money from an entity that is not necessarily their first and foremost institution may seem too good to be true. So one of the things that we had to do is be very intentional about trust building, making sure that awareness was a big factor here, which required deep collaboration with the K-12 district to make sure that we were activating not only the individuals and the practitioners in the K-12 system, but also the technologies as well. So we leveraged a communication strategy of LMS tools and others where we were really enabled by practitioners in the K-12 space to reinforce. And, one of the things that we heard time and time again is that when the student acknowledged that they heard correspondence across different entities in different directions, they realized that this was not a quote unquote scam, but that this was there to be helpful to them. So trust building, communication, outreach, these were sort of really big themes that came up time and time again that we had to work very intentionally around. And the other thing is, how do you actually get a 16-year-old paid, right? So, at Edquity, one of the things that we focus on, which we know is a key focus for Dr. Curry, is the equity of our work, right? And we need to make sure that there are payment options for all students, regardless of access to the financial system, a bank account, So whereas typically we see about 92% of students request a digital payment, right, in some form or fashion, we know that many 16-year-olds don't have bank accounts. And in fact, about 50% of students needed an alternative means of payment. So thinking through availability of different options, we were resorting to a prepaid card, which we make available as a standard offering in all of our programs. But this was another key insight, right? As folks think about their own programs, that thinking about payment optionality and how you serve this demographic in particular is really key. So those are some of the key things that came up that were really unique in this program relative to others.
Thank you so much. It's so interesting. And I think one thing, well, first of all, I should say, if people haven't noticed already, if you have any questions in the audience, please submit them through the Q&A function. We'll be able to get to them towards the end of the session. I'm really excited to hear your thoughts. And thank you for those who've already submitted some questions. And so I wanted to kind of hear from each of you, and David, you were just touching on this a little bit as well, but what were some kind of key hurdles once it's got underway that maybe you didn't expect? And how did you tackle them?
Keith, I can jump in if you want.
Yeah, I can start first. I think for me as a college president, I thought where we said we're going to offer the money, $114, I thought students were going to jump at it and sign up very quickly. And I was surprised that it took a couple announcements and followed up with the school sites and also followed with the senior leadership to encourage students to participate. I thought by students knowing that there are going to be funds available, that it'll be very simple for them to sign up. And I thought they would sign up in droves. And it took a little bit longer to get the word out for students and to know that this was available to them. That surprised me.
And to Dr. Kerr's point, right, it's if a tree falls, do they hear it? And whereas we were certainly making noise in the forest, the mechanisms and the channels that we were using were perhaps not the right ones to start, right? Which gets back to the need to really activate partners in the K-12 system and sort of the institutions themselves, the technologies that students are interacting with, to make sure that there's a multifaceted communication and trust building campaign that goes along with these funds. And that was certainly a surprise to us as well, in that the traditional channels we've used for programs in the past were not unto themselves sufficient. So really needing to be creative about how to do that work. So Jen, to answer your question, so we activated professionals in the schools themselves, right? So we actually partnered with members of the K-12 system. We also asked that they leverage their sort of LMS technology to drive correspondence out. So they were acting as communication channels on our behalf. So it requires some partnership development, some coordination with K-12 systems. I think folks that may be part of Promise partnerships or other sort of coordinated efforts across K-12 and post-secondary would be really well positioned to do this work. But those are some of the channels that we ended up using to get around this issue.
I'm wondering, maybe each of you could talk a little bit more about those relationships that you were building in the K-12 space, and specifically with high school staff as well as college staff at Compton College, in order to build that trust with students.
I would say for our campus, and I'm going to drop stuff in the chat, we have a robust dual enrollment program for our students within our community. And so we have 3 partner districts that we work with. We're offering classes during the day. We're offering classes after school. We're offering online classes to students as well. But what's critical for us in this partnership is that our educational partnership department, which does our outreach services, they have dual enrollment specialists who works with the high school in regards to enrollment of students. And so our staff meets with our K-12 partner districts from those 3 every single month. From the academic affairs side, the student services side, institutional effectiveness, they're all in the same room once a month with each district for an hour. And that's where they work through challenges and discuss new programs such as this. That to me has been going on, that's been going on for years. But it's those types of relationships is how you leverage this type of work, because you just can't roll out this type of program if you don't have an infrastructure regards to the within that community that you're serving. And so for us, that helped us is by having that infrastructure for dual enrollment, and then also be able to leverage that infrastructure to talk about this new program. But also our partner districts were surprised when students were not signed up in droves, right? And so that puts it on them to be able to do some more encouragement as well for students to sign up. But what's key to this is that you have to have an infrastructure in place. You have to have individuals assigned to the school sites to provide that support. But also you have to have some common communications too, right? What's the communication? What are you communicating to them about emergency aid? Why is it important? But make sure that's coming from all angles, not just from the college.
And there's certainly not much I can add to what Dr. Curry said. I mean, I think to the point, it just is another reason that it's so important for post-secondary institutions to build those partnerships, both with the K-12 system, but also, as I know that Compton College has done, a lot of work on supporting students around transfer pathways. Right? Increasingly, this connectivity is really critical to make sure that students are set up for success holistically, right? Whether it's dual enrolled students, transfer students, and Compton College again has done just so much leading work in this space to make that possible. So, I think that the foundational work that the college has done positioned us well to pivot some of our communication strategies to react and make sure that we're using different communication channels.
And to that end, I'm curious, for colleges that maybe are thinking about similar programs, what would be some of the learnings from this pilot? You were kind of just touching on that earlier, each of you, but what do you think that those institutions maybe can take away from this work?
I think you have to start with the communication, having common communication that's going out with a communication plan. I think that's number one. Number two is ensuring that students who qualify for emergency aid are signing up for it. So you can communicate, but then you also want to have some type of follow-up system in place to follow with those students. Three is being able to find additional funds to support this type of endeavor. Work with your local foundation, but also work with, if you have state or federal dollars that could potentially be used for emergency aid, tapping into that. I know there's a question in the chat. Someone said, you use grant money or foundation money, but you also have to look at other avenues in the future for emergency aid. And so that's one of the things we've been looking at with state dollars, of being able to try to figure out how can we continue to provide emergency aid to dual enrollment students. Because at the end of the day, dual enrollment students are your students. And so you want to make sure that the program is basically able to be institutionalized and is not a one-time thing for the organization. Because when students hear about it the first time, they'll tell other people, and they want to be able to know, how can I be able to participate? So communication, having an infrastructure to do this work, having someone to be able to follow through with the students as it relates to the emergency aid. And then four, the last piece is make sure that you institutionalize it. Make sure it becomes a priority of your organization.
And to Dr. Curry's point, I mean, again, we were fortunate to have the support of the ECMC Foundation and Believe in students who believed in this work and believed in supporting dual enroll students. But, Dr. Curry's idea for this program was grounded in sort of a policy failure fundamentally, right? Which is that the CARES Act and the subsequent federal stimulus dollars did not have an allowance for dual enrolled students, right? So it is creating a data collection and measurement infrastructure as well to demonstrate the efficacy of these programs, which I think is something we're currently doing and continues to be really important as we think about how do we make a case for making these programs sustainable over time, right? And California, to its credit, has made material investments into basic needs programs across the board, but that's a product of a lot of hard work that Dr. Curry and others have done to collect data, to demonstrate the need, to demonstrate the effectiveness of these programs, which have then codified these programs into state policy. So that is a key focus, is as you're designing these programs, think about how are we measuring this and justifying future investment into what we're doing. What is the data collection infrastructure? What data are we wanting to collect? These are certainly things that are fundamentally critical. And then the last thing I would add to Dr. Curry is just considering who the students are. How are you actually getting the money out, right? So yeah, we did, to answer Jesse's question in the Q&A, we did have an application, right? And in doing that, you want to make sure the application is a low barrier, right? So students were applying in as little as 6 minutes and receiving funding in as little as 6 hours, right? So speed matters both in reducing administrative burden and also in getting the cash out. But also for this audience, again, many of them will not have access to a bank account, right? So how do we meet them where they are? Having digital payments allows for us to process with speed, but when they don't, how are you getting around that? How are you getting either a prepaid card out or check, or how do you think about other payment options like PayPal, et cetera? So those are some of the insights that, I might offer in addition to what Dr. Curry said.
That's great. And I also noticed that we have some great questions both in the chat and the Q&A. So I want to be sure, because I think that some of what is being asked, I think relates to, what we're talking about right now. One of which is from Nina in the chat. How are you measuring? What data points are you collecting? I'm wondering if maybe, David, you wanted to take that on, or Dr. Curry.
Yeah, happy to. I mean, first and foremost, we're looking at the distribution of challenge areas that students are experiencing, right? I mean, one of the things that California was a leader on and Compton College was at the forefront of is understanding the scale and scope of basic needs problems writ large, right? And initiatives like the Real College Survey and others have allowed for establishing a baseline of what the scope of the problem is. So we've done some of that work. I sort of alluded to, again, the distribution of challenges are different for dual enrolled students. And we've seen that in the application process, and we're able to understand that this population of student does have a different set of needs in certain instances when it comes to student success. So first and foremost, there's a data collection exercise there. The other is, we've actually done an efficacy analysis in partnership with Compton College. And when we analyzed a program that we ran in the summer of 2020, what we found is that a $250 award to Compton College students was able to see that students who received that award graduated at twice the rate as those that were not funded. So we do have a rigorous evaluation method where we were able to do that again, third-party evaluation. I imagine we'll have a conversation about trying to replicate something for this audit, for this population of students over time, so that, again, we can make a case for sustainability to the state.
Great. And I wanted to also ask, we were talking about this before, but just in thinking, looking ahead, not just for higher education leaders, but in the policy space, what are you hoping people are going to take away from this work with Compton College?
Let me jump on this a little bit for David, help him out some. I think the key for us is to highlight the importance of dual enrollment and how colleges, especially we see a decline in enrollment in higher education, but specifically community colleges in California. Dual enrollment is looked at as an option for increasing enrollment, but also is looked at as an equity issue to try to increase the number of students in high school who are students of color who are taking college classes and being exposed. So when you look at it from that perspective, one, it's going to, by offering aid, you probably could be able to encourage other students who might not have thought about taking courses in high school because they might have to work or whatever other issues there are, other challenges they're dealing with. They might look at this as an opportunity for themselves to take advantage. So it's a recruitment tool, but also it's a space where students could be able to consider a class and not have to work after school because they're able to complete this course if we're providing enough emergency aid. So I say recruitment. It's also a strategy for students to take classes who are in high school, knowing that they get aid. But the third piece of this, it really addresses, from a policy perspective, is the needs of our students who are taking dual enrollment courses. It is not just about emergency aid. How do we provide support for our dual enrollment students where they're also considered our current students? What I mean by that is making sure our tutoring services that we provide for students are available for dual enrollment students. That means you have it available, it could be online, and that's what we learned through the pandemic, but offering that service. Our mental health, our counseling support for our students, make sure that's available for our dual enrollment students. What this has done is it opened my eyes to other areas within our organization that we're missing out on providing additional support to dual enrollment students, because their success and retention is a part of our college's success and retention. But if you look at data, they've been ignored because we look at it as this another opportunity. But now we can start looking at what type of support services provide, what type of emergency aid to provide. This opens up a whole new avenue to improve our success and retention of all of our students, but really focusing in on our students and dual enrollment from a policy perspective.
I think it also strikes me that we know that dual enrollment rates are on the rise too. So just thinking about how that's only going to become even more pressing. Well, I want to remind the audience, if you have any questions, please to be sure to submit them. I think we can turn to some of the questions in the Q&A that we haven't already addressed. So let's see. I think there was one from Christine Wolf-Eisenberg. To hear more about your plans, if any, to sustain emergency aid funds for dual enrollment students going forward.
Yeah, so in California, we have a couple restricted funds. We have one, which is Student Equity and Achievement, and we also have our Outreach and Retention fund that was provided by the state in the budget. And so in the Student Equity and Achievement Fund, we can utilize some of those dollars for emergency aid for dual enrollment students. And then also I'm working to get guidance from the Chancellor's Office in California regarding to our Outreach and Retention dollars to be able to use that for emergency aid. Now, the reason why I'm using those restricted funds is because next year we still have American Rescue funds available for our current students. And so we're going to provide that to our non-dual enrollment students and then shift money from our Student Equity Achievement budget to utilize that for dual enrollment students. So that just gives another avenue to keep the program going for another year.
Oh, go ahead, David.
I mean, the only thing I'll add is, again, we will continue to try to serve as a mechanism for data collection and rationalization to help reinforce the efforts to make this sustainable over time. So, Dr. Curry alluded to, he's well aware of what the existing landscape is, but also we have to do our part to evaluate this to make a case for incremental investment over time.
And I want to be sure, I think this came up earlier, but just that we did answer it. Question, it sounded like the funding for the Compton emergency funds all came from a foundation grant. Did I understand that right? If so, are there plans for continued funding in the future, which I think we were just talking about, but just to make sure that we've clarified that for folks.
Yeah, so we're looking at additional restricted funds in California to support our dual enrollment students. One thing I would say, and people who have heard me speak before, is that budgets are your value statements, right? So if you believe and you base off your data that emergency aid for your students is important, you're going to figure out a way within your budget to make it happen. And you might have to mix and match to do that. And so I always tell people when you're doing budget development and having conversations about budgets is to also think about how do you institutionalize those programs and services and really being focused on that, not just for year one, but year 2, 3, 4, and 5. Because once you start to implement some of these programs, people expect these programs to continue. And they don't understand. You can't explain to some that, oh, it's just one-time money, because our students have needs that's not just one time.
I also see there's a question here that I think, David, you were touching on before regarding, do students have to apply for this money? Was that an avenue that was possibly a barrier for students to access this emergency aid? And I'm wondering if you could also talk a little bit about the thoughts behind how you ask students questions about their needs. Because I know we've talked about that separately before, and I think some of the audience might be interested in that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the goal is to reduce administrative burden as much as possible, right? You want to make sure that you are not creating material friction or difficulty for an individual in applying for funds, but you also want to make sure that you're screening for funding in such a way that maximizes the scarce resource in doing two things, right? One is you want to award the dollar to the student that's experiencing the most acute basic needs challenges, right? So whether it's food insecurity, housing insecurity, transportation issues, childcare issues, though we didn't see much of that in the application process for this group of students, physical and mental wellness, access to technology, right? You want to screen for those sorts of conditions, but you also want to make sure that in funding the student, it will be able to move the needle on the issue area that they're experiencing. Now, we took that component of it out of this program, specifically, again, for a variety of reasons. But in general, as you're putting together an application process, you want to make sure that you're funding the student with the most need, so to speak, but also doing it in a way that's going to help the student continue to persist, right? Because again, these are scarce resources. We are leveraging a large amount of philanthropic funding, right? So there is a finite amount of money typically in these programs. As we move towards sustainability, perhaps we can be a little bit less selective in how we think about that latter criteria. But right now, that's sort of the two vectors of which we make evaluations.
Great. And I see we just got another question too, which was, so as I understand it, Compton used Edquity to handle applications and disbursement of emergency funds, and normal college scholarship administration was not used. Is that correct?
Correct.
All right. I think if anybody else has some questions, please do type in. Otherwise, I want to invite Dr. Curry and David, if there's anything that we haven't kind of touched on that was a point that you wanted to raise, to be sure that we had an opportunity to talk about it.
Yeah, and David, I know you dropped the report in the chat, but I think David, you want to talk about some of the findings?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can drop the report in the chat, which for those of you who haven't read it, can be found here. I mean, some of the key things that I think are really of interest, as I mentioned, is that we were able to see the distribution of challenges across students. So 51% of students are not just dealing with one thing, right? They're dealing with multiple things. And in fact, we found that a large swath of students are actually responsible for financial reciprocity with their own family, right? So some of the funds were actually used towards rental security deposits, or towards other bill pay that families are responsible for, which gets back to Dr. Curry's point of, this can be a good recruitment tool in the sense that it shows that the college cares and that there may be a viable path to post-secondary access while being financially responsible, not just for themselves, but also for their families. So that was a really critical finding. Many think that as a dependent, you may not have a financial responsibility to the family, but we found that was not really the case. 72% of students who were recipients are Latinx. So that was another thing, is again, Dr. Curry again wants to structure these programs with a center, as do we, around equity and how we think about decision making. And we found that almost 3 out of 4 students who were funded are Latinx. We also saw that 33% who applied multiple times, right? So that does really demonstrate the scale and scope of the challenges that students are experiencing. A lot of these issues are chronic, right? These are basic needs challenges related to food and housing. We are at a time when, in particular, food, housing, and gas prices are going up at an unprecedented rate, which is making general cost of living as challenged as it ever has, right? And it's not shocking then that students whose disproportionate cost burden goes to these three things are finding themselves needing to apply more than once. So that speaks to, in future programs, consideration of, do we change the award size? Maybe, maybe not, right? But those are some of the inputs that, as you all are designing your own programs, you might want to consider, is what are the cost burdens of these various issue areas? Again, learning resources, transportation, food, housing are the 4 biggest that we saw for students. Do you try to create an award size that is catering to some of those baskets of consumption for a student? So those are some of the key findings. Again, this is reflective of 60,000 in disbursement to about 231 students. Dr. Curry, I don't know if there are other things that you want to call out, but those are some of the key findings that we found most critical.
And I think that's important. I think the 51% regards to the multiple areas is critical too, is that we can't really pinpoint what the aid went through, what students really needed aid for. But I would say this, we just did a vaccine mandate here at our college, and we provided $250, and we have a lot of students who are in dual enrollment who qualified for that. And we made sure they knew they qualified for the vaccine requirement. And so it's gonna be interesting for us when we see the data in the summer, how many of those students signed up for the vaccine and what were their success and retention. And did we see more students sign up for that versus emergency aid? And so it's going to be interesting to see what that data looks like. But to continue to provide that support for the students will be helpful. But I think that the amount needs to be increased. And I think we need to look at what the program amount looks like for the future, because I think you will have some students who have a higher need versus other students, and then maybe putting a certain pot of funding available, and then let Edquity and the app figure out the amount of need for the students based off of who signs up first. But I think we have to increase the amount.
And again, emergency aid is a nascent field, right? So one of the interesting areas of research that we as a company want to do is we've been having the privilege of administering about $150 million of funding across the country. And over that swath of institutions, there have been different award sizes, right? So as we think about future literature and future research that needs to be done, we need to start to look at what is the incremental impact of a marginal dollar for student success, because no one has really done that work. We are all doing our best as a community and as a practitioner group to try to anchor the right dollar amount with an extremely scarce funding supply, to make sure that we can support students, but it's not grounded in best practice empirically yet. So that's something that we certainly want to do, and maybe we can make a policy justification for a $2,000 emergency grant or a $1,000 emergency grant when Dr. Curry has been doing heroic work to make the most of $114 awards, because that's what's been available thus far. So there are a couple of other questions I saw in the Q&A. One is really important. It's a question related to citizenship status. There was no citizenship status requirement for these funds. This has been an important focus for us, is making sure that this is a program available to students regardless of documentation status. So that's something that's actually been a consistency across not just this program, but also the most recent version of higher education emergency relief funding, or HERF funding, as that was a big change in the federal guidance, which originally did restrict students from accessing federal funding if they were not U.S. citizens. And then there was a second question related to, did we see differences in needs for dual enroll students as opposed to regular enroll students? Again, so as I mentioned, 51% of students applied with multiple issues. We saw learning resources, transportation, food and housing be the sort of 4 largest areas. Typically, we actually see about 70% of students apply with more than one issue area at a time. And we see housing as the #1 issue across the board. Transportation, food, and learning resources, depending on where you are, can vie for that 2nd, 3rd, and 4th spot. I think that alludes to the fact that the housing sort of housing circumstance of a student to be tied to their parent or their guardian may reduce significantly the rate of housing insecurity among this student population relative to when they are not a dual enrolled student. So that's sort of the biggest difference that we've seen in how we see issue areas by student groups.
We also have another question that I think is about clarifying dual enrolled students, that they're taking college credit courses and not non-credit workforce courses. Is that correct?
Correct.
Right. And I noticed we had also a question in the chat that was, how did you arrive at the $114 amount? Because
we're the 114th California Community College, and we did the math based off the number of students who might qualify, and to make sure we had enough money for each student. And that's why we came at the 114. But I do believe that needs to be higher as we move forward.
We had one other question here, which was, can you please share the emergency application questions? Also, do you have eligibility requirements? How are you verifying and validating to award students?
So the questions are screening for basic needs conditions. So questions related to food insecurity, housing insecurity, transportation issues, childcare issues, physical, mental health and safety issues, as well as access to learning resources. And then there are a few questions that pertain to whether or not the funds will be able to move the needle, and sort of how likely they are to graduate without in the absence of funding. So those are some of the directional questions that we ask. As far as eligibility requirements, right, we were thinking about, in this case, a dual enrolled student population was the primary eligibility requirement. And then as with regards to validation and verification of awards, Compton College shares with us the eligible student roster for the program. And then we use that to verify against first name, last name, date of birth, and ID to make sure that the student is indeed the student that they are representing. And then we were able to sort of initiate payment, digitally, in which case there's a KYC process, or through a prepaid gift card, in which case the student has to provide an address that matches. So that is sort of how we deal with the application and screening process.
Great. Well, I don't see any other questions, so please do fire away if anyone has some. And in the meantime, I actually thought maybe it'd be helpful to go back to a point that was raised earlier regarding trust. I'm kind of curious, thing it surprised you, Dr. Curry, that, students were not kind of right away jumping to take advantage of this. What do you think were some of kind of the reasons why there was some hesitation?
I anecdotally, I would say, trust within the community of, when people hear about money being available, is it true or not? And they have to trust and have credibility within the organization. And so you don't want to give a student false hope. And so I think that has a lot to do with it, because like, somebody will give me $114. And we had the same thing happened with the vaccine. Instead of $350, was like, are you sure that high school students qualify? Yes, you are qualified because you are college students as well. And so it's just trusting that there's a opportunity for you to benefit, to help support you. And they have never seen that, because our current students get the information, but our dual-enrollment students have not been exposed to that. So just trying to trust and people being exposed to it. And it goes back to information, right? So it's trusting that Compton College is a credible organization, and we do follow through with regards to emergency aid, but then also is communicating that in a manner where they understand, but also trying to figure out ways to communicate that to parents as well. So it just goes back with trust and communication.
And to Dr. Curry's point, I mean, this is at a time where digital fraud is at an all-time high, right? I mean, I get text messages from people impersonating banks that I don't have, telling me that I need to urgently reach out to them, or saying that, we've received a deposit, sign in for your information, right? And students are on the defensive, individuals are on the defensive, and not to stereotype, but given that the average age is 16, this is a generation that is a little bit more savvy when it comes to technology and being as giving when it comes to digital trust. So that is something that needed to be earned, and that's why we had to sort of really leverage all of the channels that we talked about previously.
So I see two other questions that we have. One, I think, is for you, David, which is the student information sent to Edquity not protected by FERPA?
No, it certainly is. So we make sure that we're adhering to all FERPA standards and how we're protecting and keeping student data stored. So like other data that we get from our post-secondary partners, it is covered under FERPA.
Great. And we had another question here, which was, depending on the type of funding, non-discretionary, have you been able to use the emergency funds for past bills for students that are preventing them to enroll, almost like retention grants?
So let me say this. For Compton College, we paid off the students' debt that they owed last summer for students due to COVID. And then we just did another resolution in May to pay off student debt for this spring, for this past year. So for the last 2 academic years, we have paid off student debt with our American Rescue and our HERF dollars. And that is our plan moving forward as well for next year.
Great. Well, I'm wondering if maybe we could also talk a little bit, seeing as we have a bit more time, we can wait for some more questions to come in. Someone say that, wow, that's amazing, which is great to hear. From the answer to the last question. I was curious too, maybe we could talk a little bit more regarding the particular needs of these students with being unbanked. I know we touched upon that before. I just want to bring it back to the fore because it seems like it's connected to this larger point about making sure you understand, meet your students where they are. Because it sounded like that was something that also kind of surprised you a little bit, David, when you were kind of working with students initially.
I wouldn't say we were surprised per se, just given legal requirements, right? I mean, you do need a parent or guardian to accompany you to open up a bank account until you were 16, and in some places older than that, right? So given the average age, not surprised at all that you would need non-digital payment methods. We as a default practice have non-digital payment methods, right? So we want to meet students where they are, certainly want to help facilitate optimal methods like ACH, or actually now Zelle, which is instant, right? Because we want to make sure that speed is prioritized, but understanding the student population in particular, digital payments were not always possible. So we've been using a prepaid card. One of the things that we can explore and are going to continue to look at is an e-card, right? sort of an electronically issued gift card, which can be done instantaneously. So again, as we think about speed, that's a mechanism that we'll continue to look at. There are certainly trade-offs, right? If I'm holding a card in my hand, I can write the debit note, I can put the debit card number down, I can do it at a point of sale transaction. A lot of e-cards are restricted to certain payment options, right? So there is a trade-off between speed and flexibility. But again, just thinking through those types of non-digital payment options, at least ACH or bank account oriented options, is critical for servicing this population.
Great. And I want to be sure we also learned a little bit more about the role of Believe in students in this partnership. So I'm wondering if either of you would like to highlight some of their key work in this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to share the BIS perspective. So for those of you not familiar with Believe in Students, it's a tremendous nonprofit organization that is focused on student equity, in particular best practices and emergency aid distribution. They produced one of the most innovative and first scalable emergency aid programs in the country, which is the FAST Fund. So they work in partnership with a number of colleges, Compton College included, where they have imparted funding to trusted faculty and staff on college campuses who have the discretionary ability to make quick payments to students. And they've done this at scale across many, many institutions, but they've also partnered with organizations like ours because in certain areas, you need the ability to process more applications more quickly, right? And can't necessarily go through an individual staff member. So Believe in Students has been leading the way on different approaches to emergency aid across the board. They are a 501c3 and they're a nonprofit organization. So they engage many philanthropic partners like ECMC Foundation and others to solicit capital so that post-secondary institutions have access to emergency aid and have been doing this work. I think in the last year, they've helped distribute over $2 million. So are really doing tremendous work for many institutions and for students across the country.
Great. And I see that we will send a link along from the chat to more about Believe in Students. And we'll also be sending a copy of the report to everyone as well that we've been referring to. But if we have any other questions or any other points we haven't addressed.
I think I would just say, this is just another innovative program that has evolved under Dr. Curry's leadership. I think one of the findings from the report is that this is an opportunity to also showcase other sort of support infrastructure that post-secondary institutions offer. So I know that one of the things that we were able to do is also direct students in the program or those applying for funds to other resources that Compton College has to offer, right? It's an opportunity to orient to other opportunities. And that's really important, right? Because emergency aid is one tool in a broader student success toolkit. So anchoring and orienting students to the other universe, and then also as an institution, beginning to connect these different programs, creating an experience for students that is more centralized over time. I know this has been a focus of Dr. Curry's work for some time, which is why he's been such a leader and a vocal innovator in this space. But I think that's a really important point to mention, right? Is that it's important to get this program right. It's also important to get this program right in the context of other programs that are offered to students to support various parts of basic needs and security, and creating a centralized resource for that over time. So I just want to make sure that we mention that, because it's a very, very critical point that we didn't really talk about.
And I'll put this final comment to say is that this type of work, it takes innovation, but also takes partnerships, and also takes the staff. So, they allowed me the opportunity to be able to speak on these panels and share my philosophies and my thoughts. But the work at Compton College would not have happened without our educational partnership department, who's responsible for outreach, the staff within that area, and also institutional effectiveness office for making all this happen from a research and evaluation standpoint. And then also where our local districts continuing our partnerships and being in constant communication with the local districts. So there's multiple people involved in this partnership, and then also Believe in our students and at Edquity, who were able to approach me with the opportunity. And I was able to talk about emergency aid for dual enrollment students, but it was a partnership of multiple people who understood the vision of the organization and they were unapologetic about it as well. And what I mean by that is that as leaders, we have to be unapologetic and do things differently, and do things differently for students and support student success, and be unapologetic about it. And I feel that this has worked, our partnership with all these groups, because we've been unapologetic with our focus on dual enrollment. Now, moving forward, we got to continue to be unapologetic, but make sure that we're able to institutionalize it, but also provide additional funds to support it as well.
Great, thank you. And I see we do have one other question that I think we can get to before we wrap up, which could be our final for today, which is, are you bringing financial wellness into the basic needs work?
I believe we do. We have a partnership with Operation Hope and financial literacy, providing that support. But as I look at now with COVID-19, I think we need to be doing more in that space. And so one of the things I'll be talking to my financial aid department staff and also the staff that works in basic needs, what else could we do to help support students in that space? Because I don't think it's enough. I think we look at financial literacy as a way to support students, but I think we need more than just financial literacy.
I would certainly agree with Dr. Curry. I mean, we as an organization want to be sensitive to the fact that it's tough to preach financial wellness when there's no financial infrastructure or financial basis to manage in the first place, right? So it starts with increasing access to resources over time, which Dr. Curry has continued to do at Compton College. But as we set that fundamental infrastructure in place, I do think that layering on financial wellness centers certainly can be another piece of a holistic basic needs strategy. Again, if you think about all of these different elements in a single place and a single center, right, that's touching the student, creates a centralized student experience. That is directionally where I hope we as a space and as a community continue to go.
Well, we're ending on a very inspiring note, which is great to hear. So thank you both so much for your time. And thank you everybody who's been tuning in for this conversation. And just to note that the report that we were talking about is on the Believe in Students website. You should have links in the chat to it, and you'll also be emailed a copy of the report shortly.
And everyone, I just want to reiterate our thanks to you for joining today. I want to extend my thanks to Rebecca for facilitating this conversation with the team today. Definitely extend our thanks to Dr. Curry for all of the fantastic work that he's doing and for being here with us today. And to our fantastic CEO, David Helene, for representing Edquity as well as he did on our call. As Rebecca said, we will be sending out a follow-up email that will include links to all of the organizations that were represented today. We'll make sure that a copy of the Believe in Students Compton and Edquity report are also included in there. And we'll also include a link to the recording of this webinar for you in case you need to refer back to any parts of it that are there. We'll also make sure that the links to the bios of everyone who was on today's call are linked there so that if you have any outstanding questions, you can get in touch with them as well. But just want to reiterate our thanks to all of you for joining us today.